Hello everyone, welcome back to the show with another episode of Exploder. My name's Dan, you know how this goes, let's get right to it. Wrestling is full of professional wrestling gimmicks. Everyone knows that, that's the point. A character, a gimmick, something gets you over. While many people are the Gene Kiniski types, and they like the in-ring action, the reality is the ones that appeal to the mainstream, and really to most wrestling fans to be honest, the hardcore alike, they really like gimmicks. They like people that can perform, but also have a character about them. Say what you want, but Stone Cold Steve Austin, what got him over was not his ring work. He was good before 97 when he broke his neck, and then his style changed. It became more of a ground and pound, punch, Luthez press, stomp in the corner, flip him off, fill a car with concrete, you know, the normal stuff. So people talk about the character. Stone Cold Steve Austin, the gimmick, Mick Foley, Triple H. There's these characters. That's what people go to. So gimmicks are very important to professional wrestling. Every wrestler has a gimmick they start with, and then they end up somewhere else. Everyone. No one starts day one of the gimmick that they end up at WrestleMania with. No one ever has, and no one ever will. But there's a difference between finding a gimmick early on or reasonably early on in your career and then becoming a star later on. This episode, I want to talk about the retreads. The guys and girls who just get a gimmick and they just keep finding new gimmicks because nothing they do seems to get along. Now, there are two versions of this. There are those that go through a bunch of crap gimmicks and at the end actually catch on and actually do something and become more famous for their leader gimmicks. And then there are those who just have constantly overdone gimmicks and they never really catch on, they never really get a foothold, and so you have a list of gimmicks that exist, but they never really have somebody get over because of them. So that's the two differences. When I'm talking about the individual, I'm going to talk about that person, and I'm going to explain the difference, I'm going to explain which one they were. I mean, honestly, if you're a big wrestling fan, you'll know which one it is, but if you're not sure, you never heard of this person, or you're not as familiar with them as someone else would be, I'm going to talk about that. So, without any further ado, let's talk about the retreads. The people that just have multiple gimmicks through the years, and for whatever reason, they just keep on going. Let's start it off with an old-fashioned one, little old Van Hammer. If you don't know Van Hammer, first of all, lucky bastard. Second of all, Van Hammer came into WCW in the early 90s as a hair metal rock guy. Had the big stringy hair, came to the ring with a guitar, looked like he was like the 6th or 7th man in Guns N' Roses. You know, keep in mind, most of the people in that band were on drugs at the time, so he could have been a roadie who just snuck in and did stuff with the groupies. I don't know. Point is, Van Hammer was a rocker, and that's about all there was to the gimmick. It didn't last that long, and he'd find himself doing pretty much nothing, jobbing and all that. Now, 1997 comes along, Raven has compiled his flock, and of course he needs a giant man, so he gets Hammer, who now has got his hair straightened down, he's wearing makeup for some reason, and a fishnet shirt with a nipple ring sticking out of it. That's a visual I never wanted in my life, and he's simply known as Hammer. That would last the entire run of the flock, his flock membership as it were, and then Van Hammer once again would go back to Van Hammer and he'd become more of a hippie type, more of a peace and love type, wearing the tie-dye and the long hair, and honestly, if you look at him, and if you ever heard the guy talk, that was about right. That was probably like 1 degree of separation from his real life, so it's a retread, but really it's just being honest. After that, he became Major Stash, a name that I've covered before, was supposed to be Private Stash, which of course was a reference to, you know, private marijuana. But of course, in this fake military of the Misfits in Action, being the most senior member in the ring, he thought he shouldn't have had the lowest rank. That's right. Van Hammer argued about the rank in a fake army. So they made him Major Stash to assuage his ego, and it did no good because it was a fake army. But I digress. As for a career, he never really went anywhere. He was always Van Hammer, he was always in WCW, he always had some kind of gimmick, but he never really got beyond, that guy's pretty tall. Wonder what the gimmick they got him doing today. And that's about it. That's pretty much all there was about Van Hammer. And there's really not much else to say. Now here's one that's very interesting because he went across 2 promotions, actually had a pretty good run despite the fact that he was constantly doing different gimmicks. But let's talk about Chuck Palumbo. Chuck Palumbo wrestled in the independents as Triple A. No, not a knockoff of Triple H, it just happened to be Triple A. I remember seeing a magazine article about it back before WCW had even signed him. He was called Triple A, did a bunch of indie stuff, and I guess that got the look, and he went to the power plant, trained with Dwayne Bruce, which means did Hindu squats until his leg started bleeding. Within 6 or 7 months, he's on TV, and they made him Chuck Palumbo, which is his real name, I guess. I don't know. He started as a Lex Luger ripoff. I don't mean like, he had muscles like Chris Masters. I mean, literally, he was a Lex Luger ripoff. They brought him in to feud with Lex Luger because he was the new total package. It had about the charisma and excitement as that entire sentence was, just to say, wow, I was edge of my seat. After that, he teamed with Shawn Stasiak, and meanwhile, Sean O'Haire teamed with Mark Jindrak, and they formed a group called the Natural Born Thrillers with Reno and Mike Sanders, and of all those guys, one of them still in the business. Guess which one? Mark Jindrak. As Marco Corleone, everyone else in that group is either dead, in the case of Sean O'Haire, or out of the business, including Chuck Palumbo. But again, there's more to that story. Anyway, so they finally took the tag teams, they split them up, and they put Chuck Palumbo in with Sean O'Haire. They won the WCW tag team titles right as WCW was being sold. WCW was bought by Vince McMahon and the Evil Empire, and he brought, of all the people they sent to HWA, and all these guys they sent to developmental or just flat out got a pink slip, they kept Sean O'Haire and Chuck Palumbo in addition to Shawn Stasiak and Mark Jindrak and so on and so forth. Sean O'Haire and Chuck Palumbo, despite being WCW champions at the time, really didn't have much of a character. They were two guys that I think only existed at the time to get the crap kicked out of them by the APA, and they did. Later on, Chuck would dye his hair blonde and end up in a gay but not gay but really gay tag team with Billy Gunn. Billy Gunn, who I'll get to, this was certainly a highlight of his career. These two started with the innuendos, sort of like Lenny and Lodi if they were allowed to push the envelope a little bit. Hey, remember Lenny and Lodi? No, you don't. Anyway, they went on all the way to, they hired a personal wedding organizer, whatever the hell Rico was. And again, another guy, Rico, fully straight, but playing this really flamboyant, let's be honest here, gay character, to the point where they were having a commitment ceremony in the ring before they were betrayed by Eric Bischoff, who was in full makeup. They were attacked by 3-minute warning. It was a whole mess. Following that, Chuck would dye his hair back to black or whatever, or let it go the way it was, I don't know, and he would become a full-blooded Italian, because apparently he was just a greasy Italian this whole time, and he was holding it behind. Teaming with Johnny the Bull Nunzio, and they had a little run. After that, they brought him back yet another time. These are on WWE. Keep in mind, since he started teaming with Sean O'Haire, this has all been in WWE within a period of 5 or 6 years. He comes back and he becomes like, I can't explain it. He was like a dime store biker. Like if The Undertaker, the American Badass Undertaker, was done by like a third-rate promotion. That's what it looked like. And they acted like it got over, but it didn't. It was just Chuck Palumbo, the 4-time retread on a motorcycle. His hair was the same as when he was in the FBI. He rode around the ring. They acted like it got over. I think it was on SmackDown. They acted like it got over, but it didn't. And he was gone. He didn't last that much longer after that. I mean, that's another guy. Another guy who's reasonably talented. He played the Billy and Chuck thing to the hilt, but the reality was he did so many gimmicks that it was just like, what else are you going to do with the guy? So he's another guy that didn't really succeed. He didn't really make anything of himself, and there really wasn't. It was just retread, and then nothing. Then of course there's the people that make a career of being a retread, like to the nth degree. They're able to retread gimmicks over and over and over, and despite the fact that they're always something new and some new gimmick and not wearing a mask, or I mean literally just them with a different name, really very similar gimmicks at times, over and over and over, they still make a long career. I'm talking about a guy who's going into the Hall of Fame right now, Brutus the Barber Beefcake. Oh my God. Brutus the Barber Beefcake started, he wasn't even Brutus the Barber Beefcake. He was Brutus Beefcake. He teamed with Greg Valentine, and they were the Dream Team, managed by luscious Johnny V. The Barber thing didn't come along until after he'd left the Dream Team. So he was Brutus the Barber Beefcake from, I think it was 87 to, oh my goodness, what was it, 87 to 93. Yeah, when he left the WWF and ended up in WCW. Well, he came in and they called him Brother Brudi, which was really close to Brutus. So that didn't work. Then he turned on Hulk Hogan and became the Butcher. That's actually better, and if it was anyone but him, it probably would have caught on, but it didn't. Then he went completely wacko bananas and became the Zodiac, the man who said yes and no all the time, the man from Yin and Yang or something like that. Like, what the hell was that? And then, of course, he turned out to be a spy all along, and he became the Booty Man. Yeah, because that was a gimmick. His finish was, wait for it, the high knee. Get it? Because high knee. Because WCW was written by a 12-year-old. Yeah, exactly. His last gimmick in wrestling, of course, would be the Disciple. He would literally be someone who followed Hulk Hogan and then very briefly the Ultimate Warrior. Don't know what that was about. But he wore a long beard and he looked like a really aging biker, and he was called the Disciple. And his finish was a Stone Cold Stunner, but they called it the Apocalypse. Because if you want to take one of the best finishers in the history of professional wrestling, you want to give it to Brutus Beefcake. I mean, clearly, that's what you want to do. But hey, who am I seeing? I have all these gimmicks, and some of them are just stupid and dumb, and that's not mentioning the one where he came out and was attacking people, and he had some kind of weird mask on, but the man with no name, or whatever the hell he was, I don't know what he was. That's not even counting that. I know that one happened, but it wasn't that long, so... But this guy's turned it into a Hall of Fame career. He's going into the Hall of Fame. Think about that for a second. He's going into the Hall of Fame with this. 30, 40 years of being every name under the book, working for every company, you know, the major companies, being Hulk Hogan's boy or whatever the hell he is. He's going to the Hall of Fame. So for as goofy as it is, it worked. You can't really fault him for that. At the end of the day, it worked. We have a favorite team in the Raw Bowl. It's Newsflash. Rey Mysterio will be driving the pace car at the Auto Club 400 on March 17th. He'll be using a booster seat. In Hall of Fame news, Brutus the Barber Beefcake is going in because Hulk Hogan brings his friends everywhere, and Tori Wilson will join the Hall because after you pose nude for Playboy, they pretty much have to let you in. Stay tuned for Ashley Massaro in the class of 2024. Ty Dillinger recently asked for and was given his release by WWE, ending his time with the company. Kurt Hawkins and Mojo Rawley are the only two kids left backstage at the kids' table. WB is headed back to Saudi Arabia for shows in May and November of 2019. Saudi Arabia has some big assassinations planned this time around. They're still 15 years away from letting Bayley hug anyone. Well, that's going to do it for this time. Let's get back to the show. Then we have to go to the other side of the aisle and talk about what the WWF was doing. Yeah, that's right, I'm talking about Billy Gunn. Billy Gunn came to the WWF in 1993 as part of the Smoking Guns with his brother, Bart. You know, Gunn, because they're Guns, it was their last name. Yeah, they came out wearing stuff that looked like it belonged in a country concert, wearing cowboy hats, duster jackets, firing fake blanks into the air, you know, the usual. The team would break up, and that would lead Billy Gunn to sort of be on his own for a bit. Billy would eventually become Rockabilly, be managed by the Honky Tonk Man, because if you need a successful career in your life, at some point you have to be managed by the Honky Tonk Man. Those are just the rules. Who, by the way, is also going to the Hall of Fame. What the hell? But I digress. He would then, thankfully, join up with the Road Dogg and form the New Age Outlaws. Road Dogg, of course, was being, at the time, the real Double J, Jesse James. It's like being the real version of something no one gave a crap about. They joined together as the New Age Outlaws. The New Age Outlaws eventually joined Generation X, went from heel to babyface, and did very well for themselves. Now, during this time, Badass Billy Gunn, as he was now called, slowly devolved into where it was less about being a badass and more like just being, well, an ass. Yeah, for a while there, he just went by the name Mr. Ass, which completely cut out any kind of subtlety that the name character had. And the character didn't have a lot of subtlety, but it took away what was left. Mr. Ass would go around for a while before the New Age Outlaws would just break up the first time, and then he would become the One Billy Gunn. What is the One? I have no idea. I don't think they knew. It wasn't a Matrix reference. It wasn't anything of note. It just said the One on his trunks, and he was the One. So yeah, after a little while of not doing anything, of course, he would find his way into the aforementioned Billy and Chuck, the gay but not really tag team that was, again, incredibly successful when it probably shouldn't have been. He would then drop the gimmick and sort of fall off and do a whole lot of nothing on SmackDown before being released by the WWE in 2003. He would then immediately go to TNA, because back in the day, that's what you did. You left WWF television, you walked right off of TV, got on a plane, flew to Florida, jumped right on their TV, and had a grand old time until the checks stopped coming. He would come in first as the New Age Outlaw. Well, the WWE, really didn't like that one. They also didn't like when he decided to call himself the Outlaw. Gee, I wonder why. He then settled on Kip James, joining up with the other James, BG James, reuniting New Age Outlaws, but not really, in a time where they both admittedly were really deep in their alcohol and drug abuse and bitter about everything, to the point where they were calling out Shawn Michaels, Triple H, and even Vince McMahon, and in a group called the Voodoo Kin Mafia, VKM, which is probably the three weirdest words to put together to try and sound like a badass. Voodoo Kin Mafia. What the hell was that? After that time faded, he would go away, come back, and this time come back as Cute Kip. What was Cute Kip? I don't know. He worked with the women. He was Cute Kip. Years later, W would hire him as a trainer. He would come in and work behind the scenes, and of course, he would get cut and sent home after they found he tested positive for steroids when he was bodybuilding before W hired him, long story short. And now in the indies, whenever you see him, what's he as? He's Billy Gunn, because that's the gimmick that's going to survive everything else. So again, now that's another guy. He's a guy who had a whole career and how all these things happened and had a lot of weird different names along the way, but he found the Billy Gunn name, he found the Billy Gunn character, the badass Billy Gunn character, and ran with it. And there were some variations over time, but he's had a long career. And of course, and again, they're going to the Hall of Fame as part of DX. Him, Road Dogg, X-Pac, Triple H, Shawn Michaels, and Chyna. Yeah, but no Rick Rude. What's the deal there? Anyway, so that's again another example of somebody who's able to do that. That was pretty good. Then you can't talk about constant changing gimmicks that somehow became successful without talking about Charles Wright. If you don't know who Charles Wright is, why do I keep doing that? Anyway, Charles Wright started his WWF career in the early 90s as Papa Shango, the guy who famously cursed the Ultimate Warrior to vomit, I don't know, or his hair to bleed, I don't know what was going on there. That worked for a time where Repo Men and chicken farmers and all of these things were common knowledge, you know. Any roster that had the Warlord, Skinner, and Damien Demento, Papa Shango was perfectly fine. Papa Shango would later on come back as Kama. My mistake. Kama was the Supreme Fighting Machine, sort of as a precursor to the UFC, Ultimate Fighting thing. UFC at the time was still its infancy. It was more or less like they called it human cockfighting, and to be fair, they were probably right. Kama Mustafa, and he had a whole thing, and he was a fighter, and he had like a mohawk, and that was, okay, but then he joined the $1 Million Corporation, which was where all the winners went, and then later on he would come back as Kama Mustafa as a member of the Nation of Domination. That was very successful, and they would sort of start calling him the Godfather of the Nation, sort of creeping it in, and eventually around 1997, 1998, Shane McMahon of all people came with the idea, well, let's just turn him into what he is, and he started dressing a little more over the top. And before you knew it, Kama Mustafa was gone, and the Godfather was born. Now, the Godfather, let's call it what it was, the Attitude Era, he was a pimp. There's no way around it. Now you're going to talk, even if they do a gimmick like that, which they won't, they'd be more shy about it. They'd be more tongue-in-cheek, wink, wink. No. This was straight up. They called the women he was with hoes. That's what they were. He was a pimp. He wore ridiculous outfits, looked like he fell into Snoop Dogg's closet and came out with the puffs of smoke and everything. And the Godfather was really over. Again, really over. Great gimmick, and it was based somewhat on Charles Wright's real life, being a guy who grew up came up in the nightclub industry, strip clubs, and the like. He would then leave the pimping life behind because, as we all know, pimping ain't easy, and become the Good Father as a member of the Right to Censor. Stevie Richards, former porn star Val Venus, Bull Buchanan, Ivory, Stevie Richards, and of course, the Good Father. Yeah, the Good Father. The gimmick played itself out, ran as long as it did, got a bunch of heat, was destroyed almost immediately, at one point destroyed almost single-handedly by The Undertaker. And what would happen? Well, the Godfather would return. He would team up with D'Lo Brown, where it was like his pimp in training, not sure how that works out, and had another good run with it. Again, this is the guy who took a career, who started in the WWF in the early 90s, and ended up working well into the 2000s because he was a talented guy, and he changed his gimmicks, but at the same time, he eventually found the Godfather character. That worked, and did really well with it. So, bravo to Charles Wright and the Godfather. I'm going to take a second to talk about our new sponsor, the Matt Riddle Bro Box. With the rise of box subscription services, of course Matt Riddle's going to get in on the game. This box comes to you discreetly in a package so people don't think it's weed. It comes with Crocs, an official Matt Riddle ball cap, a quarter pound of marijuana, and a Dude to English dictionary, which includes phrases like, just chill, bro, what's the major damage? And of course, dude, what? See for yourself what it's like to be a real-life version of Bill and Ted with your own Matt Riddle Bro Box. From the makers of Zack Ryder Woo 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 Fire Alarm and the Bobby Roode Glorious Bedazzler. See what all the hype's about. To order your own Matt Riddle Bro Box, send $20 worth of sock money to 420 Chill Out Lane, Encino, California. Offer not valid in Arizona, New Mexico, or wherever Pauly Shore currently is. Of course, a list like this would never be complete without one of the most successful guys to ever get constantly retreaded, Glenn Jacobs. Glenn Jacobs started in the WWF in the early 90s as the Christmas Creature. What was the Christmas Creature? Well, it looked like a tree had fell into a tinsel factory and the whole thing exploded, and one man rose from the ooze. That's about the only way I can explain it. From the Christmas Creature, he went to Smoky Mountain and became Unabomb. Yeah, Unabomb. I don't know. Good gimmick. I don't know what the name was supposed to... Whatever. Isaac Yankum DDS, the dentist with bad teeth because it was the early 90s, and that was considered a gimmick. He became the fake Diesel because the WWF really needed that at the time. He went down to the USWA and became Doomsday, which actually had a really, like a Lord Humongous type look. The hockey mask with the skull on it, the whole gimmick. That whole thing was used to teach him to work in a mask. And of course, after that, he would become Kane, the guy we know, fear, and in some cases vote for today. So again, a guy who's constantly retread. It all worked out in the end. He just had to, the expression is you got to kiss a bunch of frogs. And that man kissed a lot of frogs. But it ended up being Kane, and he's been Kane since 1997. And now he's mayor in Tennessee. Not the path that most people saw coming, but hey, good job. Okay, let's talk about another one. A lot of these start in the WWF, I've noticed. Not saying WCW didn't have gimmicks, but they never had gimmicks that really lasted that long. They do a gimmick and then they move on, and it'd be short term. This one started in the WWF as Crush. Bryan Adams started in Crush as a member of Demolition as Bill Eadie, or Axe, was winding down and was dealing with a allergy, I believe. Crush came in, big guy, face paint, long hair, worked the gimmick. As Demolition was fading away, Crush would take about a year off. He would come back as what's affectionately known as Kona Crush, which was basically him with blonde hair, no face paint, and he was a Hawaiian surfer bro, I guess before the term bro was used in that manner. Again, not bad. His finish was like this head crusher thing. I don't know what that was about. He would then turn on Randy Savage in 1994 and become the Evil Crush, which you notice because his hair got darker. He started wearing darker clothes and had like a thing of face paint on it under his one eye. Was managed by Mr. Fuji, which is a sign of pure evil. We all know that. He would then disappear again and be arrested in Hawaii in real life. I don't know, whatever. He would then come back as Prisoner Crush. He would join the Nation of Domination with Farouk and Savio Vega. This one he would come back with a completely fake face tattoo. Yeah, I don't know why that was a choice. Braided hair, beard, the whole deal. And that would run until the group would eventually implode from the inside and break apart. He would then transition that into the braids into actual long hair, and he'd become the Biker Crush with chains, 8-ball, and skull. And believe me, I'll get to the two of those eventually. That lasted until basically the storyline had played out. Bryan Adams, of course, being a good friend of Bret Hart, was not happy with Montreal Screwjob. They were all released. Bryan Adams would go to WCW, become Bryan Adams, and join the NWO, become another fodder for the crowd. Another one of the 47 members of the NWO, including Virgil. For a brief, and I mean brief moment, he would then become the Demon. The Kiss-inspired corporate synergy from Hell character. He would be the Demon for 2 appearances and then go, wow, let's give that to the rookie. Dale Torborg would take it, and Bryan Adams would go back to being Bryan Adams. Bryan Adams would then join Chronic with Brian Clark, the former Wrath, and he would finish out his career in the mainstream as a member of Chronic with a slightly different look, no more beard, still long hair, wearing a mesh tank top thing. Don't know what that was about. As a member of Chronic. His last match in the mainstream, of course, would be as a member of Chronic against Kane and The Undertaker in a match so bad I'm pretty sure it's considered a war crime, and he was never seen again, despite the fact that he was a bodyguard for Randy Savage's rap career. Yes, Randy Savage had a rap career, oh dear God. Speaking of Skull and 8-Ball, let's go all the way back. Back in the day, there were these 2 twin giant bastards who went to the WWF, and they were called Jacob and Eli Blue, a bunch of backwoods hillbilly redneck types managed by their uncle Zebekiah. Dutch Mantell, Zeb Coulter, call him what you will, he was managing these 2 twins. 2 giant twins, long scraggly hair, big giant beards. The only thing you could tell the difference was their tattoos were on the opposite arm. I noticed that even back then. The gimmick itself would not last long. They would go to the Independents. They would become the Bruiser Brothers. Really the same thing. Gimmick, 2 big guys who could, I guess, decently wrestle. Okay. They then become the Grimm Twins for a very short moment. Then, as Crush would leave the Nation of Domination to form the Disciples of Apocalypse, they would bring in Brian Lee, who was their real-life cousin, and of course, the 2 now bald twins, Skull and 8-Ball, as a part of DOA. As the Gang War storyline fell apart, as it finally ran its conclusion and DOA was gone, Bryan Adams was gone, Skull and 8-Ball would stick around for a while and actually feud with the Legion of Doom, and at one point have Paul Eller coloring, turn on Legion of Doom to join Skull and A-Ball, which made no sense, but then again, they also gave him a puppet at one point, so really it's anyone's call. They would then eventually leave and go to WCW. They would come in as a group called Creative Control, the muscle for Vince Russo, as Patrick and Gerald, a nod or joke, I guess, toward Pat Patterson, Patrick, and Gerald Briscoe, Gerald, Creative Control, haha, whatever. They would then join the NWO 2000 as Big Ron and Heavy D, before finally, after all of this, going by their real name, Ron and Don Harris. Yeah, they're two guys that are big guys that are twins, and they went through all those different names, but the whole gimmick was, the whole time, they were twins who were halfway decent in the ring. And again, those guys never, they were there, they worked at WWE, they worked in WCW, they worked in TNA. But again, never really big stars, but hey, doing what they needed to do, sure. Then here's a weird one, then here's a very weird one. It was sort of like a guy who could have been a lot bigger, but just didn't work for whatever reason. I'm talking about Ron Reese. Ron Reese started a really weird career in WCW as the Yeti. If you don't know who the Yeti is the one that Tony Schiavone can't pronounce properly, and he was a giant mummy called the Yeti, I don't know, who, how do I put this nicely, got to know Hulk Hogan in a prison way at Halloween Havoc, and was immediately pulled from the group. He apparently came out of a glacier or something. No, not came out of glacier. A glacier. Get your minds out of the gutter. Anyway, he was immediately pulled from the group because this was a really dumb idea. By the way, for a group that once named a character after the Holocaust, the Yeti was too dumb for them. Just gonna let that be. He then became the Super Giant Ninja, which was basically a 7'2" guy they put in a dime store Kmart brand Halloween costume. That lasted about as long as that sentence. Then he became Big Ron Studd, named after his trainer, Big John Studd. Okay, not bad. A good WCW Worldwide, maybe even Saturday Night type character. He would finish out his career in the WCW as Reese, the giant monster, although a retread, the giant monster in the flock. A big guy who could do a bunch of things, including throw Juventud Guerrero around like a lawn dart. If you've never seen that, go watch it. It's pretty fun. But yeah, so again, a guy who got retreaded and put in masks, not a mask, and he had a name, then he didn't have a name, then he became Reese. Again, it was a good thing. He made money for the time he was there, but again, he was never a big star. But for what it was, he did okay with it. Then, of course, with names, you cannot talk about other names, gimmicks, without talking about one of the biggest names of all. Now, there's two names here I'm going to get to. I'm going to start with Virgil. That's going to be the first time anyone's ever said that. I'm going to start with Virgil. Virgil was the manservant of the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase in the late 80s. He came in. He actually was his manservant. It was a gimmick. It was kayfabe. So he actually did drive the limos and take care of his stuff and whatever. That lasted from 1987 until 1992, where he finally got enough of it. Apparently 5 years is the limit on being treated like that. And then he became like a pseudo-boxer type gimmick, facing off against Ted DiBiase for the $1 Million Championship. As soon as that gimmick died out, so did Virgil's character. In 1996, the NWO needed a head of security, and who do they call but their old buddy Virgil, because everyone who worked for the WWF at one point got a contract. I'm pretty sure there was a popcorn guy that got hired there at some point. Vincent. That's right, he became Vincent, named after Vince McMahon. Haha, take that, man with name Vince. I don't know. Later, he would be renamed by Vince Russo, because there was another Vince all of a sudden, by Vince Russo as Shane. Get it? He then would join the West Texas Rednecks and be Curly Bill, because why not at that point? At that point, they could have called him Lord Gigantor. It doesn't matter. He was a goofball. They made him Curly Bill. He was a black cowboy in a group full of people, by the way, where most of them were actually from Minnesota. I don't know how many cowboys are in Minnesota, but I'm going to go with less than 5. But yeah, so that's the story of Virgil. Oh, and now his current gimmick, of course, is being the sad person at conventions that no one invites him to. So I don't know if that's a gimmick or just a sad indictment upon his character. But here we are. Now here's the fun one. This is the fun one. I'm going to close out with this one. Ray Traylor. Ray Traylor. Who's Ray Traylor? Ray Traylor started his wrestling career as a guy named Big Bubba Rogers. He actually started as a jobber working in the Carolinas and working in the territories. And eventually he was brought back as Big Bubba Rogers, the silent yet deadly. That sounds like a fart joke. It's not. The silent enforcer for Jim Cornette. He would do that for a while before before the WWF would get a hold of him, bring him in, and of course everyone had to have a gimmick. More than just being the big quiet guy, they needed a gimmick that worked. The gimmick, of course, was he used to be a prison guard, and while working in the territories, he actually was a part-time prison guard, so they made him the Big Boss Man. The Big Boss Man would run from the late 80s up through the early 90s, and did a pretty good career, teaming with Hakeem as a member of the Twin Towers, and eventually getting a singles run. Remember the match with the Mountie, the U.S. versus Canadian legal system, law enforcement, as it were. You know, the difference is a lot less people get shot in Canada, but I digress. He would then leave the WWF in 1993. He would go to WCW because I think legally you had to, and he immediately became the boss, and the WWF didn't like that. So then he became the Guardian Angel. The Guardian Angel, of course, was named after this, I wouldn't say vigilante, but sort of neighborhood watch type group in New York called the Guardian Angels. Then that didn't last because there were actually people called the Guardian Angels, and they didn't like the fact that he was called that, because that's not the point of trademarks. So finally, after this, he went back to Big Bubba, the gimmick he had years ago in the NWA. He owned it. Good for him. He would be part of the NWO. Then he'd get kicked out of the NWO. He'd go by his real name for a bit, by Ray Traylor, and then leave the WCW and go back to the WWF and become the security guard, bodyguard, what have you, for Mr. McMahon in the corporation. And of course, he would once again become the Big Boss Man, now wearing like a flak jacket, tactical vest type look, as opposed to his powder blue prison guard uniform from the late 80s. He would be with the company, and of course, his last run with the company was in 2002, him teaming with, of all people, Curt Hennig. And they had a little run before, of course, Curt was fired, and eventually Big Boss Man was let go, and unfortunately, he passed away a few years later. But again, another guy who went through a bunch of different gimmicks, but again, made a great career of it. If you really look at a guy like that, he made a hell of a career out of what could have been, or should have been, really not that much of a thing. For someone who changed his name so many times, I mean, this guy was still well known, still well respected, and honestly, a lot of people, even in the business, I mean, every time you hear an interview or somebody, they talk about somebody who they really love him. They knew Ray Traylor, and they liked him, and he was a good guy, and he was a solid worker, and he was never a main event guy, but he always had something going on. He was always dependable. So even if all those name changes happened, it still wasn't the end of the world, because it was a solid guy underneath it, and I think that makes all the difference. So yeah, well, that's going to do it for this time. This has been Exploder. My name is Dan. Have a good one.